All right, so we'll get going with our second session here of 4 today. Did you enjoy Dr. Mason, the first session? Kept you awake? Made your brain hurt? Did you get all that? No, of course not, right? Unless you're really into astrophysics. Yeah, some of it's obviously going to be above our heads, but isn't it nice to know that there are scientists, there are Bible-believing scientists and researchers who've taken the time and done their homework, and as he showed, there's not just one answer to explaining, this is for some people a huge question, how can we explain seeing the light from those very distant objects in space, galaxies in space? And there isn't just one biblical answer, there's 5 potential models, potential answers, using things like relativity and so on within a biblical framework that can answer that question. I met a gentleman, was 4 years ago now, who he said he rejected Christ outright because of that question. He thought the church is never ever going to have an answer to that question, therefore the Bible must be wrong, so I don't need to listen to you talk to me about Jesus. Now, he was a Christian when he spoke to me, because someone had showed him a portion of, you know what, maybe there's different things happening with time in different parts of the universe. If God stretched out the heavens, that's going to have relativistic effects that he hadn't thought of before. And so once that stumbling block to faith was removed, he ended up becoming a Christian. But that was the question that he struggled with. That was the stumbling block in his mind that he struggled with, and yet there are answers to those things, or a number of potential answers. In any case, we're going to switch gears a little bit and not talk about cosmology in this session here before lunch, but the flood and its after effects. And I've kind of titled this, Noah's Flood, the Key to Understanding Earth's History. And that might seem like a bit of an odd statement to make. Really? The flood is the key to understanding the history of the earth, ancient history and that kind of thing? I hope an hour or hour and a half or 2 hours, whenever we're finished here with this, you'll see how that makes more sense. No, we'll finish in about an hour, and then it's lunchtime. But hopefully in an hour from now, you'll see how that makes more sense. The flood really is the key to understanding the history of the earth. But just to kind of get us pointed in the right direction, let's consider, what would a global flood do? You ever thought about that? If the Bible's right about there being a global flood, and we certainly believe that it is right, what would a flood do? What sort of mark would a flood leave that we, like scientists today, that we could go and investigate, people could see? What kind of a mark would it leave? Well, just to think about these things a little bit, there would, of course, be massive erosion and deposition. We see that even in small floods, right? A global flood, there'd be massive amounts of erosion and deposition on a global scale. Global flood, global erosion and deposition. So it's going to impact our understanding of the Earth's geologic features, the surface features anyway, and it would bury plants and animals, again on a global scale. That's going to impact our understanding of the fossil record in a major way. And it would restart human history. The Bible says the whole Earth population was rebooted from 8 people. Only 8 survived the flood. So it's going to impact our understanding of ancient history, ancient nations, how they started, when they started, where they started, that kind of thing. Or saying it negatively, if we turn it around, denying a global flood will lead to a misinterpretation of data in geology, paleontology, and ancient history. Those are the 3 areas we'll quickly look at here before lunch. There are others we could look at, but we'll focus on those 3 areas in particular. And denying a global flood? Well, that's the name of the game, right? That's what happens in Canadian society. Nobody today, especially in academic environments and in intellectual environments, if you go to university, for example, and stand up and say, yeah, I believe there was a global flood about 4,400 years ago, and only 8 people survived, and all the ancient nations began after that point. Well, you're going to get scoffed at. You're going to get laughed. You'll be laughed off the university, right? Denying a global flood is what happens all over the place today. And it's interesting that this situation is more or less prophesied by the Apostle Peter. Peter says, scoffers will come in the last days, and people believe we're in the last days now, it's probably true, following their own sinful desires. They will say, where's the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. Are all things continuing as they were from the beginning of creation? No. There was a global flood that dramatically upset those things. All things have not continued at the same rate in the same way. And Peter goes on to explain exactly that. He says, for they deliberately overlooked this fact, that the heavens existed long ago and the earth was formed out of water and through water, as Jim just talked to us. It was initially water. It was formed out of water and through water by the word of God, and that by means of these, the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. So what do these scoffers deny? What are they denying? They're flood deniers and creation deniers. They deny creation and they deny global flood. And that pretty much describes Canadian society for the large part, right? They deny creation. We evolved, the universe evolved. And no, there never was a global flood. That's obvious, they say, from geology. No evidence for a global flood. Before we get into kind of paleontology and geology and so on, let's have a look at 12. We're going to look at 12 sort of rapid-fire biblical evidences for a global flood. Not a local flood, because there's plenty of people in the church today say that Noah's flood was a little flood. Over in ancient Mesopotamia, not a global flood, little flood. Let's have a look at evidence for a global flood. If you're taking notes, 12 points here. Number one, the need for the ark. The need to build an ark itself is an evidence that the flood was global. Otherwise, God could have just told Noah to move, right? If the flood was local, God could have told Noah to pick up and move. He told that to Abraham a few chapters later. Abraham moved quite some distance, as it turned out. He could have told it, why build an ark if it's not a global flood? Just move. So the need for the ark is an evidence for a global flood. The size of the ark is an evidence that was global. The ark was huge. It's not this little bathtub ark that Dr. Mason showed last night. Here's a picture of the ark again, and that looks a lot like the model that we have, the scale model sitting out in the lobby here. Here's some things parked beside the ark that we're kind of familiar with. Very large airplane, 747 airplane. Fairly large dinosaur. There's an elephant and giraffe there. The ark had a huge carrying capacity, over 500 railroad stock cars. Naval engineers have built scale models of this thing according to the biblical dimensions there. They put it in wave tanks, the same tanks that they used to test ocean liners and cargo ships and things. Turns out the dimensions of the ark produce a very stable device, a very stable vessel. It can list, as it turns out, nearly 60 degrees and not capsize. I hate to think what's going on inside with the animals. If it lists 60, everybody would have to be wearing seatbelts and that kind of thing. But a very stable design. The dimensions came right from God there. So the size of the ark itself is an evidence that the flood was global. Why do you have to build it that big if it's just a local flood? The need for animals to be on the ark, right, is an evidence that the flood was global. If it wasn't global, why did Noah have to take animals? If there's a local flood in a particular area and some animals get wiped out, and that's sad, but after the flood goes away, the other animals go in and repopulate. The animals needed to be taken on board the ark because the flood wasn't local. It was a global flood. Animals needed to be on the ark. Which leads to the question, could all the animals fit onto the ark? And again, Dr. Mason went through the calculations yesterday. The Bible says 1 pair of all the land-dwelling, air-breathing animals and the birds. Insects are probably not included in that description, and they may have survived outside the ark on floating seeds and twigs and logs and everything else ripped up at the onset of the flood there. And out in Winnipeg, when we're speaking out in Winnipeg, one of the questions they have is, why did Noah have to take mosquitoes? Because they've got mosquitoes out in Winnipeg the size of helicopters. Leave the mosquitoes behind, please. But anyway, they survived. 7 pairs, likely 1 pair of the unclean, 7 pairs of the clean animals gives us an upper limit, as Dr. Mason already said last night, 16,000. Probably not that many. So 8,000 pairs or less. The average size, as he mentioned, used to be thought the size of a sheep. Newer calculations suggest probably that of a rat. But let's go with worst case scenario. Let's say it was the size of a sheep. Probably not. But how much floor space would 16,000 sheep-sized animals take up? About a third of the floor space of the ark. It's probably not even that much. Again, what about dinosaurs? Dinosaurs are land-dwelling, air-breathing animals. So if we start our thinking from Scripture, and as Christians we need to be doing that in every area, not just creation, evolution, and the flood, but dinosaurs are land-dwelling, air-breathing animals. So they would have been brought to Noah. Not that many kinds of dinosaurs, maybe 50 kinds or less. God likely brought young dinosaurs, and again, Dr. Mason talked about this last night. I mean, don't bring the full-grown Brachiosaurus that grows over 4 stories tall in adulthood. Bring the smaller, don't bring grandma and grandpa, bring the junior hires, right? It just makes more sense. They eat less, they do other things less, it's easier to take care of. And then 16,000 animals, 8,000 pairs. Some of you who know a wee bit about biology, you might be saying, well, there are way more than 8,000 species alive today, but there was speciation after the flood. Imagine this is the cat kind here, and at creation down at the bottom of the screen, God creates the main cat kind, and then there's diversification within a kind, as we talked about yesterday. Here's the saber-toothed cats. They seem to be a little different branch of cats. Then at the time of the flood, God brings representatives of those two on the ark, and after the flood, we have the diversification. Cheetahs seem to be a separate branch here, the smaller cats that we'd have in our homes, and then the big cats. It's looking more and more likely that all the cats that we have in the world today came from a single pair that got off the ark. It's really interesting. Hybridization experiments and things seem to be pointing in that direction. Number 4, the need for birds to be on the ark. Why did Noah have to take birds if the flood was local? Doesn't make any sense, right? But he was commanded to take birds, and they were on the ark. Number 5, the judgment was universal. Look at the language here in Genesis. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I've created from the face of the land. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah is the only one that's singled out. But it's universal. It applies to everyone. Everyone on the earth. The judgment was universal. Number 6, the flood was a type of the judgment to come. So in the New Testament, we read this connection between, for example, in Matthew 24 here, look at the connection back and forth. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. The flood of Noah is a type of the judgment that's to come. If the flood of Noah was a local flood and only affected a portion of the earth and some people escaped God's judgment at the time of Noah, does that mean that the future judgment, once by water, next time by fire, does that mean that people in the coming judgment, some people are going to escape? No. The flood of Noah was global. Everyone was affected, as will be the flood, as will be the coming judgment by fire. Peter puts it this way: the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. But by the same word, the heavens and earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. Number 7, the waters were above the mountains. The Bible says the waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. A cubit is the distance from the tip of your hand to your elbow, roughly 18 inches, about 1.5 feet. That would mean that's it's more than 20 feet or 7 meters above the mountains. How can it be a local flood if all the tops of the mountains are covered? Right? If the high points are covered, everything underneath that is going to be flooded as well. We had one of our graphic artists years ago do an image of so a mountain covering local flood. What would that look like? And this is what he came up with. Right? It doesn't make any sense, right? If the mountains are covered, that means everything's covered. Anyway, so you got the mountains were, the water was above the mountains, global flood. Number 8, the duration of the flood. The flood began in the 600th year, the second month, the 17th day of Noah's life. It ended in the 601st year, the second month, the 27th day of Noah's life. So the flood lasted a year and 10 days. What kind of a local flood lasts a year and 10 days? That's quite the local flood there. No, global flood. Number 9, has God broken his promise? You remember the rainbow covenant that God made with Noah and all of his descendants, that he's never going to destroy the earth in this manner again with a global flood? But if the flood of Noah if it was local, well, there have been thousands of local floods every year. God would have been breaking his promise every year where there's local flooding. But has God broken his promise? No. Noah's flood was global, and there hasn't been another global flood. We would have noticed, I'm sure. Number 9, all people are descended from Noah's family. And I'll say more about this in a few minutes, but if you have a study Bible, in your study Bibles around Genesis 10, you may have a map that looks something like this in your study Bibles. It's called the Table of Nations. And it traces Noah's sons and grandsons and great-grandsons. You can see some of their names there. Some of the world's most ancient nations can be traced directly back to Noah through his grandsons and great-grandsons. Now, if the flood was low, if there was many other people who existed, and there wasn't a global flood, and there wasn't just one family from which we all came, regardless of your ancestry, why would you be able to do that? The ancient nations should be traced back to many different people, right? Why do they all go back to one family? It's because there was a global flood, and only one family survived on the ark. And we'll say more about that again in a few minutes. Also, there's hundreds, and some people have said thousands, of flood legends, flood traditions all around the world. You can see some of them, and they have striking similarity, many of them, to the account in Scripture. For example, here at the end of the chart, you have people in Fiji and Hawaii have a flood legend. Now, if the flood of Noah was local, only over in ancient Mesopotamia, why on earth would people in Fiji and Hawaii have a flood legend that is similar in many accounts to the biblical account? Why? Because all those people, including the Hawaiians and the Fijians, came from Noah's family. That's why all these nations have a flood account. Because in their people's history, all their people's history goes back to Noah. Flood account. Very difficult for evolutionists to explain that, or people who believe in deep time, millions of years, and no global flood. All people descended from Noah's family. Number 11, the Hebrew terminology. You can look at the original language there in those 3 chapters, the flood chapters there, Genesis 6 to 9. For example, the word earth is eretz in Hebrew. It's used 46 times there in the flood account. For example, God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth, there's that word eretz in Hebrew, is filled with violence through them. Look at this next sentence. Behold, I will destroy them, the wicked people, with the earth. God actually tells us, yes, the judgment on the wicked, that's the primary cause for the flood, but God actually tells us he's going to destroy the earth. Not just the people on the earth, but the earth, eretz. Genesis 7, we looked at this verse already. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that, look at the terminology here, all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. Universal language, universal flood. Number 12, last one, the New Testament speaks of the flood as global as well. For example, Luke writes, the flood came and destroyed them all, not just certain people, he destroyed them all. Peter writes, God did not spare the ancient world, that's the word cosmos in Greek, where we get our English word cosmos from, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, that's all, Noah and 7 others, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. So the terminology in the New Testament speaks of the flood as global as well. Now, what would we expect to find? Again, let's get back to that. In geology, if the Bible's right about there being a global flood, in geology, that's a study of rocks, the Earth's rocks and so on, we'd expect sedimentary rock showing evidence of rapid deposition. Not this, slow and gradual millimeter per year. If they're right, this is basic stuff here. If there was a global flood, we'd expect evidence that the rock record has been deposited rapidly. So we'll have a look at that and see if that's the case. We'd also expect large-scale geologic features, let's say continent-wide geologic features. If there was a global flood, it's going to produce large-scale geologic features, right? Just basic stuff here. In paleontology, fossils, we'd expect evidence for both rapid and recent burial, maybe even evidence that plants and animals were buried alive. The rapid rise of the floodwaters, mud flows coming across the continents, rapidly burying things, so they didn't die and slowly lay on the bottom of a lake and were slowly covered with sediment. That's the conventional story. Rapid burial and recent burial, not buried millions of years ago, buried recently. If there was a global flood, if the Bible's right, that's what we would expect, right? Basic stuff. This is what we'd expect. We'd also expect a general pattern to the fossil record with exceptions. The flood is going to bury things in a particular pattern, but it was catastrophic, so we would expect exceptions to that pattern. And we'll have a look at that in a few minutes here. In ancient history, we'd expect evidence that human population in ancient nations began about 44, 43, 4,500 years ago, back to the time of the flood. So that's where we're going here in the next few minutes. Let's back up and take these things one at a time now. In geology, we'd expect evidence of sedimentary rock, that's rock that was laid down by water, of rapid deposition. It was laid down rapidly, not slowly. Now, let's turn to the scientists, let's turn to the people out in the field. Is that what they're seeing? Is that what we're seeing in the world around us? Here is, actually this is not a scientist, I took this picture. I went whitewater rafting for 5 days through Grand Canyon. And we took side hikes, and this is one of the canyons that we hiked into here. This is two photographs stitched together here. This is actually slide film. I shot this on slide film. This was before digital cameras in the 90s here. Anybody remember slide film back in the day? Yeah. So this is, anyway, there's a person's head just down here for scale. And notice, okay, so we have some bending here of these rock layers, and over here, the layers are tilted nearly vertical. So how did that happen? What's the explanation there? Well, the rock layers were laid down, must have been fairly quickly, because when that uplift, some kind of uplift happened over here that tilted those rock layers, as you can see, nearly vertical, and at the junction between the more or less horizontal layers and the now vertical layers, the rock has been bent. Well, again, the preferred explanation is that the entire thickness there is quite some thickness, quite a number of feet thick, was laid down rapidly, and then before it had time to fully lithify, before the mud turned to rock, that uplift happened, and the layers were still muddy. They were still bendable, in a sense. If they had fully lithified and turned into stone, you would expect that there would be a break there. Not bending, but the rocks would be fractured, right? So the preferred explanation is that this thickness of rock was laid down rapidly. And then the uplift and the bending happened very soon after that. So there's an evidence for rapid deposition of those rock layers. Here's another one. This is from the Bay of Fundy out in Nova Scotia, Joggins. Joggins there. There's a fossil cliff, and here's a tree-like plant going through multiple layers of rock. Well, obviously, all of those layers must have been laid down at the same time, burying the tree-like fossil before it rotted. Because if we go with the slow and gradual, millimeter per year type of notion, the top of that thing would have rotted long before it would have been fossilized, right? So rapid burial, rapid deposition is going on there. And there's other tree-like fossils. Here's a vertical fossil tree with its base in a coal seam. So what's going on there? Trees don't grow in coal, and how can it go through multiple layers if each of those layers take a year to lay down or longer? It must have been buried quickly. So there are some examples of rapid deposition. There's many others we could look at. We don't have the time. We need to keep moving on here. But there's many others we could look at. Next one, large-scale features. Large-scale geologic features is another prediction that we would make if the Bible's right about there being a global flood. Do we see large-scale features? Yes. Let's go back to Grand Canyon. Here's a cross-section of the rock of the canyon. The canyon's over there on the right-hand side. You can see it there. And the first thing we notice is the huge extent of some of those layers. You can see them exposed when you go to Grand Canyon. You can see the edge of those layers here in the canyon, but those layers continue over a huge area in the American Southwest. Some of those layers that are exposed there in the canyon can actually be traced to England. That is a large-scale geologic feature. That's large-scale deposition. And also large-scale erosion, not just large-scale deposition, but large-scale erosion. Have a look at the strata at the rim of the canyon. If we follow that further to the north, well, further north, there's thousands of feet of additional layers of rock. You've got Bryce Canyon, Zion Canyon. We were there as a family last year, or 2 years ago now, 2018, and beautiful places there in the American Southwest. Maybe some of you have been there. But there's thousands of feet. So how much of that thickness at one point extended over the Grand Canyon area and has been eroded? There's good evidence for about 5 kilometers of that thickness extending over the Grand Canyon area that has been eroded. So we see there in that part of the world, the huge layers laid down during the large-scale geologic features, layers of rock layers of mud being laid down, which became rock, and large-scale erosion. Toward the end of the flood, as the water rushes off the continents, we'd expect huge amounts of erosion. We see that here in this area. Utah, Colorado, Arizona there. Here's another large-scale feature, the fit of the continents. The continents seem to have moved apart. You've heard of Continental Drift? The first person to write on that was actually a creationist. Here are his drawings. Dr. Antonio Snyder wrote in a French journal, 1859, he actually published, same year as Darwin, Darwin published his famous book in November 1859. But he thought, being a Bible-believing scientist, he thought that the breakup of the original supercontinent, because the continents do have a jigsaw puzzle-like fit, the breakup probably happened during the flood. That's what he was proposing at the time. He didn't have the science back then that we have today. Turns out he was absolutely right. Today, there's very, very powerful and robust models that can explain the rapid breakup of the original supercontinent during the flood. So this is what we're talking about. Imagine this is the west coast here. You've got Vancouver out here, and here's the coastal mountains. Here's the Rockies, a little bit inland, and Calgary over here. And this is the ocean plate here. It's being pulled into the earth by gravity. It's very heavy, being pulled into the earth. And the idea is that this happened quickly. Once you break the friction and get it moving, it actually happens in a conveyor belt-like fashion. And that model, that's called catastrophic plate tectonics, CPT, that was developed by this gentleman here, Dr. John Baumgartner, working at Los Alamos National Laboratories, a fairly prestigious scientific outfit if you're familiar with World War II history and so on. He was using supercomputers to get this model to work properly. You can't run this on a PC, not even a Mac will do it. I don't know if there's any Apple people here, and it's not going to do it. But all of the conservation of energy equations, a very complex model, and to get it to run properly, you need supercomputers. He's acknowledged by other geophysicists in the field as having developed the best 3D supercomputer model of plate tectonics. He's the #1 guy in the world in modeling the movement of the tectonic plates on the Earth. #1 guy in the world. His model has been independently duplicated by other researchers, and they get the same result. That shows that you're doing good science. If you keep a good logbook and so on, you've done a model, other people can do the same thing and get the same result. That's a good thing. And by the way, Dr. Baumgartner is a biblical creationist. Just thought I'd throw that in there for fun. The #1 guy, #1 geophysicist in the world in modeling plate tectonics is a Bible-believing Christian. So here's what we're talking about. Imagine this is the original supercontinent breaking up rapidly during the flood. Now, obviously, this is not realistic because, well, there'd be clouds, but no, and that's happening a little faster than it was. But here's some of the outputs from Dr. Baumgartner and his team, their model. This is very early in the process. You can kind of see here, this is going to become North America. That's going to become South America. So no Atlantic Ocean before the flood. Here's where it's going to be. Here's Africa. Here's India here. India's going up. Asia that's coming down. You can see the vectors and the showing direction and speed and that kind of thing. The red and yellow areas are high temperature. This is where essentially hot material, essentially molten material, is coming from deep in the mantle near the core to form new ocean floor. Whereas in other places, the dark blue areas here, along the west coast of North and South America, for example, those are subduction zones where the ocean plates are being pulled by gravity. They're very heavy. They're being pulled by gravity into the earth. So if you shrink the surface of the earth in one location, somewhere else, you've got to grow new ocean floor, and that's what's happening here. Here's a little bit later in the process. You can see the Atlantic Ocean opening up very nicely. What else? India's going up, Asia's coming down. Guess what happens when they collide? Smash. You push up the Himalayan mountain chain. Mount Everest didn't exist before the flood. Mount Everest is the result of those two plates crashing together toward the end of the flood. And Dr. Mason mentioned this a little bit last night. Everest is 5.5 miles high. And Jacques Cousteau, one of the questions that comes up is there enough water for a global flood? Cousteau, who wasn't a Christian, but he knew a lot about the oceans, didn't he? You remember his underwater programs? I remember watching those as a kid. He had these amazing underwater nature programs. He basically showed the world what was going on underneath the oceans. Incredible programs there. He was instrumental in the development of the aqua lung, which later became scuba. He said that if you were to raise the ocean bottoms and lower the continents so that everything around the world is even, is level, there's enough water in the oceans right now for a global flood of more than 2 miles. There's enough water on the earth right now. That doesn't even include the water in the mantle. There's a huge amount of water in the mantle, and that could come into play as well. But Everest, again, Everest 5.5 miles tall, there's maybe not enough water to cover Everest being 5.5 miles tall, but as Dr. Mason already said last night, there's marine fossils, there's fish fossils on the summit of Mount Everest. How did they get there? Fish don't climb mountains, right? Well, the summit of Mount Everest was at one point underneath the oceans. And then as a result of the collision of those plates, and work has been done on, if we go with the notion that most of us have probably been taught, continental drift, right? That the Atlantic Ocean is opening up at like 2 inches per year, the slow movement of the continents. Work has been done on, if you smash those plates together, India and Asia, at that speed, would it be enough to get the uplift of the Himalayan mountain range? And the answer is no. You need to smash those plates together at a higher rate of speed to get those mountains. So where did the water come from? The oceans. And the earth is still mostly covered with water today. And catastrophic plate tectonics explains other large-scale geologic features. The fit of the continents that we've already talked about. And if you take into account the continental shelves and a bit of stretching and compression and so on, they kind of go back together like a puzzle. Also, there's massive pieces of former ocean floor deep in the Earth's mantle, near the core. A number of years ago, measurements were made, seismic measurements of the density, the temperature of the rock down inside the Earth. It's represented pictorially here. So you can see that the continents outlined in yellow there. Some of them. The gray sphere in the middle is the core of the Earth. The blue areas are low temperature rock. The red areas are high temperature rock. What puzzled the geophysicists and geologists is how come there's still so much cold rock down near the core? If those are the ocean plates that have been slowly subducting for millions of years, that rock should already have heated up to the temperature down around the core. How come it's still so cold? And Bible-believing scientists looked at that and said, it's because it hasn't been down there for millions of years. It's only been down there since the time of the flood, a little over 4,000 years ago. It hasn't had time to heat up to the temperature down around the core. And there's the data for it. Again, large-scale geologic features deep inside the Earth that confirm a global flood. There's many others we could talk about, but for sake of time, we need to move on. Paleontology. In paleontology, we'd expect evidence for both rapid and recent burial, maybe even evidence that living things were buried alive. So let's turn to the scientists. What are they seeing in fossils? Do they see evidence for both rapid and recent burial? Yes. It's all again, powerful confirmation of the biblical global flood. Here's a fish fossilized in the process of having its lunch. Rapid burial, right? It's like it's frozen in time, a snapshot in time. It's an action shot. Rapid burial. And here's some other rapidly buried animals. It's a fossil octopus and a fossil jellyfish. Now, if they weren't rapidly buried, see, at least the fish has some cartilage, but the octopus and the jellyfish hardly have any hard parts. It's mostly soft and squishy material, which means if they wouldn't have been rapidly buried, they would have rotted, right? Like a jellyfish laying around on a beach. How long could that thing last? A week? Maybe? Actually, a week ago, yesterday, I was walking around on a beach in Vietnam. Just got back last Sunday. We met there, the CEOs from the six offices around the world. We have an annual meeting, mostly in Southeast Asia. The food's good and it's cheap and whatever. But I didn't see any jellyfish, but a jellyfish laying around on a beach, that fossil, that animal had to be rapidly buried because you wouldn't have a fossil if it wasn't. You could make the case that if we go with the slow and gradual version of the Earth's rocks and the fossils, the one that we've been taught and that's in the textbooks, things die and they sink to the bottom, they're slowly buried on the bottom of the ocean and so on. You could actually, I think, make a case that there shouldn't be any fossils in the world if that's how they were buried. Because on that incredibly long time scale, everything would rot. There's creatures at the bottom of the ocean, crabs and so on, that come along, nibble away everything, and the bones disintegrate. There wouldn't be anything left to fossilize if it wasn't rapidly buried. So, do we see rapid burial? Yes, absolutely, here. And there's many other examples. What about recently buried animals? Well, a famous dinosaur hunter, Dr. Phil Currie, he works with the University of Alberta. He's a Canadian, not a Christian, but he's a world-famous dinosaur hunter, dinosaur fossil guy. In his dinosaur book, he said this, amazing. Bones do not have to be turned to stone to be fossils. And look at this. Usually, most of the original bone is still present in a dinosaur fossil. Is that shocking? The original bone is still there. It may be infilled with sediments, that the infilled sediments may have turned to stone, but the original bone is still there. Can bones last 65 million years? Back to the time of dinosaurs? I doubt it. It's still organic material, more or less. It'll still rot over time. And an example of that, Wankel Rex, here's a T-Rex named Wankel Rex after its discoverer, Kathy Wankel. It's about 90% complete. Very unusual to find a big animal that's 90% complete. Dr. Mary Schweitzer, another fairly famous paleontologist, she describes it this way. This is an exceptionally well-preserved specimen of the Tyrannosaurid dinosaur, Tyrannosaurus rex. Shows little evidence of permineralization or other diagenetic effects. Most fossils show signs of sediment infilling or secondary material deposition, but certain specimens can show little evidence of diagenetic change. Okay, what does diagenetic change mean? What does that mean? Here's diagenesis. It's the sum of the physical, chemical, and biological changes that take place in sediments as they become consolidated into rocks. She's saying there's little of these kinds of changes that have taken place around Wankel Rex. It was recently buried. There hasn't been time for those changes to take place yet. Back to Dr. Phil Currie. The nodules, the iron nodules, prevented water from invading the bones. Now look at this next sentence. Which for all intents and purposes cannot be distinguished from modern bone. So you've got Wankel Rex, and let's say a cow that died a month ago. So here's a modern bone, and here's the bones from Wankel Rex, and he's saying the bones from this T-Rex cannot be distinguished from modern bone. So what's the logical, put on your scientist hats for a moment, what's the logical conclusion? If the Wankel Rex bones look like modern bones, they're modern bones, aren't they? They haven't been buried millions of years ago. They look just like modern bones. That fits with recently buried animals, rapid and recent burial. And it gets more dramatic than that. A number of years ago, these things were found. This is a blood vessel and blood cells from inside a Tyrannosaurus rex bone. There's hadrosaur soft tissue. There's been more than 50 instances now of soft tissue found in dinosaur bones, including the soft and stretchy tissue, blood cells and blood vessels from a variety of different dinosaur specimens. Different kinds of dinosaur proteins have been analyzed, including histones. That's the kind of protein associated with forming the double helical structure of DNA. And little bits of dino DNA have been discovered. Not enough to have Jurassic Park all over again, so don't get too excited, but those are incredible discoveries that speak of recent burial. DNA, soft tissue, blood cells, and soft and stretchy tissue found in dinosaurs. Obviously, the deep time folks, the evolutionary history folks, they realize that this data does not fit into their idea of the history of the universe. And so some scientists got together, well, theoretically, how long could DNA last? And it turns out that bone is a fairly well preserver. It's a fairly good preserver of soft tissue and things like DNA. It's pretty good Tupperware, in other words. And what they came up with, DNA could theoretically last 6.8 million years. But that doesn't help if you're trying to get it to last 65 million years. That's not even close. That's about a tenth of the time going back to dinosaurs. But here's the kicker. It could last 6.8 million years if it's frozen solid. A lot of these dinosaurs are found in Montana. They have summer in Montana. They're not frozen solid for 65 million years. And then the time just goes down after that. But lots of evidence for both rapid and recent burial. What else would we expect to find if there was a global flood in paleontology? A general pattern to the fossil record with exceptions. Because what would a global flood do? Well, the first things to be buried would be creatures at the bottom of the ocean, right? If we really concentrate on what would a global flood do, the waters get more violent and so on, and rain on the continents, you have mud flows. At the first things to be buried we would expect to be marine creatures, and then fish, and then amphibians, and then reptiles that live near the shore. And the last things to be buried, very, very high in the fossil record, would be things that live in the middle of the continents, like mountain goats, right? So that we would expect a general pattern to the fossil record. Actually, let's take a bit of a rabbit trail here. Just looking at the composition of the fossil record gives us a very strong indication of what might have caused the fossil record. 95% of all the fossils in the entire world are marine organisms. 95% of all the fossils. It's clams from bottom to top. Little light bulbs should go on in every one of our heads. I wonder what might cause a fossil record that's composed 95% of marine organisms. How about a marine catastrophe? That fits pretty good, doesn't it? But just for thoroughness, let's look at the other 5%. Of the remaining 5%, 95% of that 5% is algae and plant fossils. That's all the trees, the trillions of tons of coal all around the world, and all the other invertebrate fossils, including the insects. 5% of 5%, or 1/4% of the entire fossil record is vertebrates. That's all fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and dinosaurs. Of the vertebrates, of that 5%, 1%, or 0.0025%, are vertebrate fossils that consist of more than a single bone. That's why finding things like Wankel Rex, like that T-Rex there, that was 90% complete, given all the fossil record, that's very, very rare. So those finds are incredibly valuable, seeing something like that. But just looking at the composition of the fossil record gives us, it points us in a very strong direction as to what might have caused the fossil record, right? Marine catastrophe is a good explanation for that. Okay, what would a global flood do? Well, the first things to be buried would be creatures at the bottom of the ocean. So there's a general pattern there. Now, and also moving water has a tremendous ability to sort things by size, by shape, and by buoyancy. It can sort things out. And even in air, moving different sediment through air. For example, scientists have done experiments. You take different grain sizes, silt and sand and that kind of thing, and drop it in air. If you drop it into a flask, it settles itself out into layers. As those different size particles interact with each other, it settles itself out. You can see fine layering there. That was a homogenized mixture when it began, and it settles itself out. We saw that on a little larger scale than this at Mount St. Helens. This section in the middle here was deposited, there's a person down there for scale, that was deposited in about 3 hours on June 12th, 1980. Mount St. Helens is a volcano. What happened was the volcano erupted, there was pyroclastic flow, steam and dust and ash and all kinds of things come flying down the mountain. And if you have a close-up view of that layer, there's fine layers. It's settled itself out into these coarse, fine, coarse, fine, coarse, fine little layers there. Very interesting. And then if we ramp up the scale again, if we go to Grand Canyon, one of my favorite places, wow, there's a canyon with different layers of rock, and within each one of those layers you have fine, coarse, fine, coarse. Very interesting. Moving water has the ability to do things like that. Now, it was a catastrophic event, so we should observe exceptions to the general pattern. A general pattern, but with exceptions. That's what we would expect if there was a global flood. Now, here's where we part company in a major way with the evolutionary scenario, because they say there's no exceptions. No exceptions. Evolution predicts a very, very ordered pattern because they have these different layers of rock, and what they're saying is some of the guys in this layer evolved into the guys in this layer. And so in this layer, you're never, ever going to see again the guys from this layer because they don't exist anymore. So they have to have a very, very ordered sequence in many cases. Is that what science shows? That's what evolution predicts. Is that what the data supports? Well, no. There's out-of-place fossils all around the world. Here's one example of that. That cliff that you see in the distance there, that's the Roraima Formation in South America. It's dated by the evolutionists to be more than 500 million years old, 550 million years old. Now, in that cliff face, here's a closer view of it, it's very rich in fossil pollen. Pollen. Here's the problem. Flowering plants that make pollen weren't supposed to have evolved for another 390 million years. How can you have pollen 390 million years before the plants that make it? That is an out-of-place fossil. And there's dozens and dozens of examples like that where the fossil record just doesn't fit the order that evolution says it should. It doesn't work. Here's a picture from the top of it there. It's a tourist attraction, apparently. You can go and visit that place in South America there. But that doesn't stop evolutionists from drawing things like this in textbooks. And you might be familiar with this if you remember this from your school days, or maybe you're in school and you just recently saw this. And they have this very ordered sequence of supposedly simple life. We now know that there's no such thing as simple life. There's only extremely complex and mind-bogglingly, stupidly, crazy complex life. There's no such thing as simple life. But anyway, they say apparently simple life to more complex life, and they have all this arranged very neatly in this little scale here, and they say there was a point in Earth history where there was the age of dinosaurs. That was dinosaurs. And then there was the age of mammals. The dinosaurs went extinct. The age of mammals. Very neat, ordered sequence of this. Is that accurate? Is that actually what the rock record reveals, or is this just in textbooks? No, this is just in textbooks. Dr. Karl Werner, we had him at one of our conferences last year. He has his own television production studio, and he's a surgeon. And he's really into this. He has gone around to museums. He and his wife, Debbie, traveled to museums and interviewed the people that run the museum, some of these scientists and so on. He's found hundreds of mammal species in the so-called dinosaur layers. He says, paleontologists have found 432 mammal species, not just individuals, mammal species, in the dinosaur layers. Almost as many as the number of dinosaur species. And then he says, but where are these fossils? We visited 60 museums, but did not see a single complete mammal skeleton from the dinosaur layers displayed at any of these museums with the dinosaurs. This is amazing, he says. Isn't that interesting? Parents, grandparents, you can take your kids or grandkids to a museum, and even though the scientists know that there was a whole bunch of mammals running around at the time of dinosaurs, in the museum displays, they don't display that. Because it was the age of dinosaurs. There weren't maybe a few little mammals running around. That's the story, but that's not the science. That's not what the rock record shows. Now here's another problem for the evolutionary scenario. Living fossils. And you might say, I don't get it. Fossils are dead. You know what living fossils are? Living fossils are things that don't evolve. Wee bit of a problem for evolution. For example, ginkgo trees. These trees are alive today, and they appear in the fossil record. They're dated by evolutionists to be 125 million years old. Their fossils are 125 million years old. Here's the problem. The fossils look identical to the living counterparts. So there's been no evolution for 125 million years? Bit of a problem. That's what they call living fossils. And there's many examples of those. Crocodiles, supposedly 140 million years old in the fossil record, identical to the crocodiles that we see today. The Tuatara lizard, 200 million years. Horseshoe crabs, 200 million. The Lingula lampshell, 450 million years old. Neophyllina mollusks, 500 million years old. Say that 10 times fast. Neophyllina mollusks. But huge problem. And there's dozens of these things. Living fossils are a big problem for evolution. Why? Because the evolutionary history doesn't include a global flood. The flood is the key to understanding the history of the earth. This thing here that we've seen in textbooks, it's wrong. It only exists in textbooks. It doesn't really describe what scientists are seeing in the rocks around the world. One of our scientists, Dr. Tasman Walker from our Australian office, he redid this chart, scrap that one, and do a more biblically faithful one, and one that's more faithful to the data. Here's what he came up with. So here's two scales, actually, a rock scale here and a time scale here. So here you have the time scale. You have creation starting around 4000 BC. That was a short period of time, but it produced a huge amount of rock. God created the land on day 3, right? And so you've got a lot of rock produced there, and then you had the era, roughly 1700 years, not a lot of rock produced. Yes, there would have been rivers that would have taken sediment from the continents and moved it to the ocean, but not a whole lot going on geologically. Then you have a global flood, which was a short period of time, about a year or so, and it produced a huge amount of rock. It would have ripped up a lot of this originally created rock and redeposited it. And Dr. Walker has broken up the flood into different stages. And this is very helpful for getting us as Christians to think biblically about the world around us. That mountain range further west, or south of us, we got the Appalachians, and out west in Winnipeg, we've got this very flat area, and so on. And so how do we understand that? The first 40 days, the Bible talks about very, very dramatic, very violent, and so on. The eruptive phase of the flood. Then the waters continue to ascend. They reach their zenith, their top point, at this point here. So you have the world being inundated at this point. Then the Bible says the waters begin to abate. They begin to decrease, and once they get low enough, they begin to disperse off the continents. Well, at each one of those phases, we can imagine different geologic features being produced. This is much more helpful in understanding the rocks around the world than that previous one, that science shows doesn't exist. And he's broken those different phases into different things. I realize you can't read this. You can get this on our website. Type in, biblical geological model. And if you're into geology, you can download this. I've got these charts and pinned up on the bulletin board at my office there at CMI. But there's a much more helpful chart to understand biblical geology and paleontology. Let's move on. Ancient history. What would we expect to find? Evidence that human population in ancient nations began about 4,400 years ago. Let's start with something simple. How about population growth? Is it even possible to get, what do we have, 7.5 billion people today from the 8 that got off the ark about 2,400 years before the flood? Well, the current population growth is 1.1% per year. What that means is for every 100 million people, 1.1 million are added every year. That's a 1.1% population growth. All you would need to get the current population from the 8 that got off the ark is 0.5%. So the flood's in the right ballpark, right? Now, what if humans began 1 million years ago? Let's look at the evolutionary scenario. About 1 million years back to the break with the apes and so on. We had an ape-like ancestor that was common, apparently. Well, if we lower the growth rate to something completely ridiculous, like 0.01%, today it's 1.1, if we lower it to 0.01%, even at that incredibly low growth rate, today there should be 10 to the 43rd people. That's the number 1 with 43 zeros after it. Where is everybody? It doesn't work, right? The evolutionary history is way off. The biblical history, in the right ballpark. So there's another evidence, another little support from population growth for the reality of a global flood. Now, let's get back to this one here. The nations originate from Noah's family. I talked about this, the table of nations in Genesis 10 there. This is incredible, just how this works out. Mizraim is one of Noah's grandsons. Mizraim is the Hebrew word for Egypt. Some of these ancient nations can be traced directly back to Noah through his sons and grandsons and great-grandsons. Mizraim, if you go to Google Earth and select to display the original languages, Egypt is Mizir. Egypt is still called that today. You can trace that nation back to Noah. Ashkenaz, one of Noah's great-grandsons, is the Hebrew word for Germany. Canaan, that's one we're kind of familiar with, right? That's the Hebrew name for the region of Palestine there. Javan is the Hebrew word for Greece. Cush is the Hebrew word for Old Ethiopia. Meshech, or Meshech. I did this recently, and there was someone who spoke Hebrew there, and they corrected my Hebrew. Meshech, you have to get the ch in there. And I think it's a long E. I should have wrote the pronunciation here in my notes, but I think it's Meshech is the correct pronunciation. I was in Russia a number of years ago for 2 weeks on a missions trip teaching Russian-speaking pastors. I took them through Genesis 1 to 11. We went through the text, and I brought in the science that supports that so they can preach it to their congregations. But that name, the spelling unchanged, still appears in maps around the Moscow area today. There's the Meshech lowlands. It's still there today. This is written into the history of the world in a way that can never be erased. Many of these places, many of these ancient names can be traced directly back to Noah. Why would you be able to do that if there wasn't a global flood? Tracing everything back to one family. It's powerful support for a global flood. The Bible says this about the origin of nations. To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. That has implications for the origin of nations. And this is referring, by the way, to the event of the Tower of Babel. It's not referring to the breakup of the original continent and so on. If that would have happened at the time of people living on the continents, they would have been killed. It would have been a global flood all over again. So this is referring to the breakup of the people of the earth by language. A couple verses later in Genesis 11, verse 1, it says, now the whole earth, same word, the whole earth had one language. Well, in Genesis 11:1, the word earth isn't referring to the physical earth either, is it? It's referring to the people of the earth. The people of the earth had one language. It's the same usage here. So it's the event of the Tower of Babel, roughly 100 years or so after the flood, about 2247, but 100 years after the flood. So we would expect, now we can look at other historical accounts outside of Scripture. If the Bible's time scale is correct, we would expect that the most ancient nations would begin just after Babel, right? If Noah's family, okay, then about 100 years later, we have the event of the Tower of Babel, and it's after that the ancient nations would have began. Are there historical records that confirm that time scale? Let's have a look. This is fascinating. I love this stuff. Let's look at the founding of Babylon. In 331 BC, after Alexander the Great had defeated Darius, he went to Babylon. There he received 1,903 years of astronomical observations from the Chaldeans, who were there at that point, and they said those observations began at the founding of Babylon. That means that Babylon would have been founded in 2234 BC. That's about 13 years after the birth of Peleg. That's a pretty good fit, isn't it? The founding of Egypt. The Byzantine historian Constantinus Manasses, he wrote that the Egyptian state lasted for 1,663 years. Now, if that's right, then counting backwards from when Egypt was conquered in 526 BC, that gives us a founding of Egypt in 2188 BC. That's about 60 years after the birth of Peleg. That's a pretty good fit as well, isn't it? The founding of Greece, another ancient nation. According to the 4th century bishop and historian Eusebius, that's a famous name in church history, the first king of the Greek city of Sicyon, that's west of Corinth, began his reign 1,313 years before the first Olympics. Greeks, the Olympics, and so on. So that gives us a founding of Greece in 2089 BC, about 160 years after the birth of Peleg. Again, that's a pretty good fit. Now notice what we've done here. We've looked at historical records outside of Scripture that confirm and support the biblical record. Wonderful, isn't it? And of course, going along with the ancient nations, of course, it originated with the original languages, right? God confused the languages and so on. So the origin of languages also has just a fascinating history there. The evolutionary view of how all these languages came to be is a lot like their view of biology. You have one proto-language, and that's, grunts and you club your wife over her head and drag her back to your cave and that kind of thing. And then the languages apparently evolved, and we have the languages today. Here's the problem. That's not what linguists find. People who study language, there are languages that are similar, right? English and German and French and so on. There's language families. And linguists, they can group languages in about 20 or so different language families, but there's very little connection between the language families. They're seeing something like this, which fits a whole lot better with the biblical account that God supernaturally produced a range of languages that have no connection to each other. Now, there's another people often bring up, well, no, the Bible's wrong about the global flood because why? The Chinese people have an unbroken history that goes right back through your time of the flood, so there never was a global flood. The Chinese people lived all through that time. Okay. Well, let's have a look at the Chinese language. You might be familiar with some of their characters look quite different than our alphabet. Here's a word that means to covet or desire. And it's composed of other words. In this case, it's composed of the word for two trees and the word for woman. Why would that equal desire, you think? Why you put together two trees and woman and you get the word desire? Maybe it's because of, the fruit looked really good from the tree there, and there was a desire to eat the fruit. Very interesting. So that event is recorded in the characters of the Chinese language. And there's many other events from the Genesis creation account that are built into the ancient Chinese script. These are ancient characters, by the way. If you know Chinese, these are a little different than modern characters. These are ancient characters. Archaeologists have found those on bits of bone and pottery and so on. The original Chinese script. Here's another one. This means forbidden or to warn. And again, you see the word for two trees there, like the previous word, and the word for God. You put those two together and you get the word forbidden. Well, why would that give you the word two trees and God means forbidden? Why? Well, because of Genesis there, where there was two trees and they were forbidden to eat from one of the trees. Interesting. Here's a word for boat. You get the word vessel, that's kind of expected, right? And the word ate, and the word people or mouths. Wow. So the ancient Chinese language was invented, the ancient Chinese script, the writing, was invented after these events took place, obviously. The Chinese people also descended from Noah's family, not before. Amazing stuff. The account of the flood. 8 people survive the flood on a large boat. The Chinese language was developed after these events took place. Incredible stuff. So we've gone through these 3 areas, these major areas. Our time has gone already. We could talk about other consequences, but there's lots of other stuff we could talk about. What are some other consequences of Noah's flood? There was an ice age that was triggered by the flood. That's a common question. You need warm oceans and cool continents to get an ice age. Those are basically those 2 conditions. A few other details, but those are the basic ones. After the flood, because of tectonics and volcanism, volcanoes, earthquakes and things, The ocean water, the ocean temperature will be a lot warmer than it is today, which means you'd have more evaporation. You heat water up, it evaporates more. Now, how does the flood produce warmer oceans and cooler continents? Warmer oceans are pretty easy to understand. What about the cooler continents? Because of the violence of tectonics and volcanism, volcanoes during the flood, volcanoes would have put huge amounts of dust and pollutants into the atmosphere, shielding out the sun's energy, making the summers cooler. So every year, every winter, you get the snow building up. The summers are cool enough so that the snow doesn't entirely melt back every year, and you get it building up year after year after year. And eventually you get these, we're talking kilometers thick ice sheets, glaciers. Then under that tremendous weight, they pulverize rocks, they scour the landscape and so on. And that's the remains that we see today of where the glaciers used to be. So the flood is a great mechanism to produce an ice age. Beginning right after the flood, lasting maybe 700 years, the volcanoes would continue for decades, maybe centuries after the flood. The continents would slow down and jostle around. You'd still have massive earthquakes and so on. But eventually, the ocean temperature gets down to where it is today, and so evaporation slows down. The volcanism, the volcanoes slow down, and the dust and pollutants are eventually filtered from the atmosphere. The summers get warmer, and you have maybe 300, 400, 500 years of the ice sheets growing, and then a couple hundred years where they're really melting back, and we still see them melting back today in some cases. The Ice Age would have lowered ocean levels, and this is where creationists and evolutionists pretty much agree, by up to 400 feet. And the evolutionists, the deep time people, say the same thing, 300 to 400 feet somewhere. Well, that would cause all the continents to be connected by land bridges. And that really helps us understand what is one of the other questions. How did animals and people get from the Middle East, where the Ark landed, to places like Australia? Which today, Australia is an island nation. But just after the flood, you have the Ice Age, the ocean level lowers by 300 to 400 feet, and there's land bridges going through Indonesia and so on. So as the kangaroo population, for example, begins to grow in the Middle East, and there's evidence that kangaroos used to live all around the world, but they eventually make it to Australia over the land bridges. Then at the end of the Ice Age, the water level comes back up, and Australia becomes an island nation. Even today, there's no natural predator for the kangaroo in Australia. And maybe that's the reason they survived in Australia, but died out everywhere else. So there's even explanations for that as we think about a global flood and its after effects, the consequences after the flood. Here's a picture of what the maximum extent of the ice sheets would have looked like. A bit of a weird view of the Earth. Here's the North Pole. You don't normally see it like this. Here's you can see the ice sheets went down, covered pretty much all of Canada, went down some distance into the States, but Mexico's never seen a glacier. I mean, the Ice Age doesn't mean that the entire Earth is covered with ice. It's way too warm around the equator for snow. Would have been more rainy, likely, but no ice sheets down in Mexico. Other consequences, let's just wrap it up. If the flood is responsible for the fossil record, and it is, then the millions of years explanation is wrong. Right? If rock samples are taken from the rock record, which was laid down in the flood, and there's radiometric dating done on those, and Dr. Mason, that's our session right after lunch here, radiometric dating. If you take a rock from within that section, which was laid down in a global flood, it cannot be millions of years old. Right? We're just putting the pieces together here. If you get the flood right, you'll get the age of the Earth right. A flood would have aged the Earth, if you know what I mean. It accelerated deposition and erosion. If you don't have a global flood, to explain the massive layers of rock and massive erosion, it probably would take millions of years to get something like Grand Canyon, if you didn't have a global flood. If you don't have a global flood, then you need millions of years to get the geology that we see. But if you get the flood right, you'll get the age of the Earth right. Data from ancient history, geology, paleontology, any other fields, we've only covered those three here in this session, support the historical reality of a global flood as the Bible describes. And the final conclusion, you can trust the Bible. Even in this area where scoffers today will say, no, you're out of your mind, there never was a global flood, the Bible's wrong, the Chinese people go straight on back through your little global flood here, the Bible's wrong. You know what? If you look at the data, if we think about what would a global flood do, this is just what we've done here in the last hour, what would it really do? And then you turn to the scientists, the people who are out in the field researching in that area, we find that they're finding exactly what we would expect them to find if the Bible's true. It's a great time to be a Christian. We do a lot of TV shows, episodes of the TV show on that topic. There's more than 160 episodes online now. You can pick a topic. Again, even if you don't like to read, pick a topic, hit play, go make a bowl of popcorn, sit there and listen to us talk about this stuff. Creation Magazine frequently has articles on a global flood and its related effects, after effects, and so on. A great family magazine. Most of you have subscribed and that kind of thing. And anyway, the sign-up sheets are at the back there. Creation Answers book has a number of chapters on the flood and the ark and how did Noah get all the animals on there and were there dinosaurs on the ark and all kinds of things like that. If you want the details on Noah's flood, there's a book out there called Noah's Ark, a Feasibility Study. And this guy, the author here, John Wood-Morripy, he's done a huge amount of research on the flood. He's got a nervous disorder called Tourette's. Anybody know what that is? He's got insomnia. He doesn't sleep. He just does research all the time. This guy's incredible. He's about a quarter of the entire thickness of the book is his bibliography, is the references. He's looked at every argument that the skeptics have thrown at the story of Noah and the ark. How could 8 people take care of that many animals? How many animals? The animals wouldn't have fit anyway. What about the food supply? What about water? What about heating? What about light? What about ventilation? What about the smell? Every argument that the skeptics have thrown at this account, and it's refuted in this book here. He looks at all these things, and just incredible. And what kind of lights did Noah have on the ark? Floodlights. Anyway, we need to get some food here. Obviously, there's a commentary out there, the Genesis account, and this goes through Genesis 1 to 11. Obviously, as you get into chapter 6 to 9, it's going to have things there. But just because we've been to this church a number of times, and some of you know creation, you know that this is kind of the basic stuff. Let me point out some things that are a little beyond that, like next level things. There is a bargain bin of DVDs out there. This is one of them in the bargain bin. Dynamic Life, Changes in Living Things. And this has to do with natural selection and biology. It's by Dr. Karl Werner. Dr. Karl Werner is one of the most knowledgeable creationists alive today. Now, he retired a few years ago, but just an incredibly knowledgeable. That's $8. It's in the bargain bin. It's a little cardboard box out there, and that's one of them. I'd really recommend that one. Alien Intrusion. I've got the Blu-ray here. It's also on DVD. This one's a little bit scary because there's 4 million Americans, or up to 4 million, that say they've been abducted by aliens. And these people aren't all Star Trek fans and stuff. They're normal people like you and me, right? So what is our explanation as Christians? What is our explanation for people having these experiences? Is it really alien beings coming from Vulcan, millions of miles away, to sneak people out of their beds at night and do weird experiments on them? Or is something else going on? Okay, I'll give you a spoiler here. It's the modern day version of demonic possession, is what it is. And I'd recommend that. This is kind of next level stuff, but it's a movie whose conclusions will stay with you for a while. It's just, we had it in theaters last year, a number of theaters across the country, just fascinating stuff in an area that we don't normally cover in a creation conference. If you're interested in those Chinese characters, there's 2, I have one of them here, there's another, we only brought 2 of them. Faith of Our Fathers, Finding God in Ancient China. Some fascinating stuff in this book that has to do with those Chinese characters there. This dinosaur book is not a kid's book. It looks like a kid's book, it's got a drawing there. Dinosaur Challenges and Mysteries. What this is, okay, here's the biblical version of dinosaurs. Here's how dinosaurs fit into the Bible. And evolutionists have come along and tried to attack our explanation of how dinosaurs fit into the Bible. This is the rebuttal to those attacks. So this is a more scholarly, this is an adult book on dinosaurs that shores up the biblical explanation for how dinosaurs fit into the Bible. So this is, again, next level stuff. This is not your introduction to dinosaurs. This is next level resource here. Defending Genesis. This is a compilation of previous Creation Magazine articles. I said yesterday, if you have a Creation Magazine, share it. Get rid of it. Leave it in waiting rooms and so on. This one is one you can keep. You put it on your coffee table and that kind of thing. It's the best of the best. 40 years of Creation magazine. We did this a couple of years ago. We're in our 42nd year of the magazine now. This is a compilation of the best articles there. So again, next level stuff. But anyways, let's continue here. Noah's flood is key to understanding the Earth's history. Does that make more sense now than it did like 3 hours ago when I started? It really is, isn't it? It really is the key to understanding. If you don't get the flood right, you're going to be off in some of these areas. So anyways, I hope that was helpful. Let me close. I'm way over time, but we'll come on up and we can dismiss for lunch, and then we'll come back with Dr. Mason and radiometric dating after the lunch break.